She was called the Love Goddess. Her face was pinned to the walls of soldiers' barracks across the world during the Second World War. Men watched her slip off a satin glove in a darkened cinema and felt something they could not name. She was on the cover of Life magazine more times than almost any woman alive. She made 61 films in 37 years. And she died in her daughter's apartment in New York City, not knowing who her daughter was, not knowing who she herself had been, looking at the woman caring for her and asking, with complete sincerity, "Who are you?" Her name was Rita Hayworth. And behind the Love Goddess was a woman who had been abused by her father, transformed against her will by a studio that saw her as a product, married 5 times to men who damaged her in different ways, and then slowly, quietly, forgotten by the industry that had built its profits on her image, while a disease she did not understand dismantled everything she had left. This is her real story. And it begins not in Hollywood, not in a studio, not on a red carpet. It begins in a nightclub in Tijuana, Mexico, with a 12-year-old girl dancing with her father while the grown men watched. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, stories about women whose lives were used up by the people around them, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and turn on notifications. Every week we open the locket on a woman history tried to reduce to a single image. Now back to Rita. She was born Margarita Carmen Cancino on October 17, 1918, in Brooklyn, New York. Her father, Eduardo Cancino, was a Spanish-born flamenco dancer from a celebrated family of performers. Her mother, Volga Hayworth, had been a Ziegfeld Follies showgirl. Dance was the family business, and Margarita was enrolled in it before she was old enough to have an opinion about the matter. Her grandfather gave her her first dance lesson at 3 years old. By 6, she was performing on stage as part of the family act. She later recalled her childhood with a single sentence that contained everything you needed to know about it. Rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. That was my girlhood. She said she did not like dancing very much, but she did not have the courage to tell her father. When Margarita was 12 years old, Eduardo Cancino made a decision that changed everything. He pulled her out of school to become his full-time dance partner. She never returned. She completed the 9th grade at Hamilton High in Los Angeles. That was the end of her formal education. The act was called The Dancing Cancinos. Eduardo dressed his 12-year-old daughter in adult costumes, applied heavy makeup to her face, and introduced her to audiences as his wife. Because California law prohibited minors from performing in nightclubs and bars, he took her across the border to Mexico, where she danced with him in casinos and clubs in Tijuana and Agua Caliente, performing for rooms full of adult men who did not know they were watching a child. To further protect himself from California's child labor laws, Eduardo also arranged for Margarita to perform on gambling boats anchored off the California coast, beyond the reach of state jurisdiction. She danced on those boats through her early teenage years, miles from shore, with no one looking out for her except a father who was already failing in his most fundamental duty. Mistakes on stage resulted in severe beatings. Eduardo was a violent man whose discipline had no boundaries. He introduced his child to the audience as his wife. The men in those rooms believed it. And then it became something worse. Biographer Barbara Leeming, in her 1989 biography of Rita Hayworth, documented what Orson Welles, Rita's second husband, told her during extensive interviews for the book. Welles described how Rita had confided in him the full truth of those touring years. Eduardo Cancino had sexually abused his daughter repeatedly during the period when they were traveling together as the dancing Cancinos. He raped her in the afternoons and danced with her at night. Rita's mother, Volga, had known or suspected. She slept in the same bed as her daughter in hotel rooms in an attempt to provide physical protection. It was not enough. The abuse left marks that never fully healed. Biographer Adrienne McCline wrote that because her father was so abusive, she had no role models. He kept her isolated too. She had no friends her own age during the years that most shape a person's capacity for trust and intimacy. When she finally encountered men who offered her something that felt like freedom, she grabbed at it with a desperation that would cost her enormously, repeatedly, for the rest of her life. In 1935, when Margarita was 16 years old, she was spotted performing in a club in Agua Caliente by Winfield Sheehan, the head of Fox Studios. He signed her immediately. She was given small parts under the name Rita Cancino, playing what the studio called Latin extras, bit parts in forgettable films. The beginning of a career that would take another 5 years to become what it eventually became. It was during this period that she met the first man who would reshape her life. His name was Edward Judson. He was a car salesman and promoter in his 40s, twice her age, and he approached her with the specific confidence of a man who recognized an opportunity when he saw one. He became her manager. He became her husband. They married in Las Vegas in 1937, when Rita was 18 and Judson was more than twice her age. Rita later said of that first marriage, "I married him for love, but he married me for an investment. For 5 years, he treated me as if I had no mind or soul of my own." Judson understood that Margarita Cancino, with her dark hair, her Spanish features, and her father's name, was not the package that Hollywood wanted in the late 1930s. He set about systematically dismantling her and reassembling her into something more commercially acceptable. He negotiated a contract for her with Columbia Pictures and its famously ruthless head, Harry Cohn. Under that contract, Rita underwent a transformation that was as complete as it was painful. Her natural raven hair was dyed auburn and became her most famous visual signature. Her hairline, which Columbia considered too low and too foreign, was raised through a series of electrolysis treatments that burned the follicles away one by one in a process described by those who knew her as agonizing. She completed the transformation by taking her mother's maiden name. Margarita Cancino was gone. Rita Hayworth had been manufactured in her place. Harry Cohn was one of the most feared men in Hollywood. He ran Columbia Pictures with a combination of genuine commercial instinct and personal viciousness that left almost everyone who worked for him with a story they could not tell publicly until decades later. He was alleged by multiple accounts to have expected sexual compliance from the actresses under his contract, treating access to roles and career advancement as a transaction. Rita Hayworth refused him. It was one of the most consequential decisions of her professional life and one of the most costly. Cohn never forgave her. The feud that developed between them lasted for decades and shaped the terms of her entire career at Columbia, including how her image was used, how her earnings were managed, and how little control she was ever permitted over her own professional life. A man who had been spurned became the gatekeeper of her livelihood, and he made sure she never forgot it. And yet, despite the feud, despite Cohn, despite Judson's exploitative management, Rita Hayworth became a star, a real one. Her breakthrough came in 1941 with The Strawberry Blonde alongside James Cagney. A role in You'll Never Get Rich opposite Fred Astaire confirmed what film people were beginning to say. She was not simply beautiful, she was extraordinary to watch. Astaire, who was regarded as the most demanding and technically precise dance partner in Hollywood, said publicly that Rita Hayworth was the best dance partner he ever had. That was not a compliment Astaire gave easily or often. He partnered her again in You Were Never Lovely in 1942, and the chemistry between them was so evident that audiences simply could not look away from her. CoverGirl in 1944 made her a full-scale phenomenon. And then came Gilda. Released in 1946, Gilda is the film that defined Rita Hayworth's public image for the rest of her life, and in many ways imprisoned her inside it. She played a woman of dangerous glamour, magnetic and unknowable, whose most famous moment involves slowly, teasingly removing a long black satin glove while singing a song called Put the Blame on Mame. It was one of the most electrifying pieces of screen presence in the history of Hollywood. Audiences were transfixed. Critics ran out of superlatives. The scene was replicated, referenced, parodied, and celebrated for decades. She knew immediately what it would cost her. Every man I have ever known, she said, fell in love with Gilda and woke up with me. It was one of the most precise and devastating self-assessments ever made by a public figure about the gap between their image and their reality. Gilda was a fictional creation. Rita Hayworth was a shy, deeply damaged, emotionally fragile woman who had been abused since childhood, who had never chosen her own name, her own hair color, or her own public persona. But the world did not want the real woman. It wanted Gilda. During the Second World War, Rita Hayworth had become one of the most beloved pinup figures for American soldiers overseas. Her photograph from Life magazine, showing her kneeling on a bed in a satin negligee, was reproduced and distributed in extraordinary numbers. It papered the walls of barracks and the insides of lockers from the Pacific to North Africa. And then, in 1946, she discovered that her image had been affixed to the first atomic bomb detonated at Bikini Atoll without her knowledge or consent. The bomb was nicknamed Gilda. The weapon of mass destruction that destroyed the atoll was decorated with her face. She was, by Orson Welles' account, the angriest he had ever seen her. She wanted to hold a press conference to protest what had been done. Harry Cohn refused to allow it, calling such a protest unpatriotic. The love goddess had been put on a weapon of mass destruction, and the man who controlled her career would not let her say a single public word about it. She had divorced Edward Judson in 1942, filing a complaint of cruelty. The marriage had deteriorated steadily under the weight of his management style, which had always prioritized his own financial interests over any consideration of her well-being. In 1942, the same year her first marriage ended, she met Orson Welles. He had first seen her photograph in Life magazine while he was shooting a film in Brazil. He told biographer Barbara Leeming exactly what he had thought in that moment. I saw that fabulous still in Life magazine, where she is on her knees in bed. And that is when I decided, when I come back, that is what I am going to do. They married on September 7th, 1943. Their daughter Rebecca was born in 1944. Orson Welles was by any measure one of the most brilliant filmmakers in the history of cinema. He was also constitutionally unsuited to conventional domestic life. He was perpetually consumed by his own projects, chronically unfaithful, and constantly in financial difficulty as a result of the ambitious productions he could never stop planning. Rita's earnings from Colombia supported the household. Her husband's genius was more celebrated than it was lucrative, and the gap between the two put an enormous strain on a woman who had already spent her entire life supporting men who treated her as a resource rather than a person. By 1946, Rita had moved herself and their daughter out of the house they had shared with Wells. They would reunite once more professionally when Wells cast her in his 1947 film, The Lady from Shanghai. As part of the production, he cut and bleached her signature auburn hair, the hair that Harry Cohn and the Columbia Machine had spent years making iconic, into a short platinum blonde crop. Cohn was reportedly furious when he saw the result. The film was not a commercial success. After their divorce, Rita reportedly told Orson something that became one of the most heartbreaking lines of her entire biography. She told him, "You know, the only happiness I have ever had in my life has been with you." Wells later repeated this to biographer Barbara Leeming and followed it with a reflection of his own. He said, "If this was happiness, imagine what the rest of her life had been." It was a devastating line. And a damning one, because the marriage to Orson Welles, for all its genuine passion and for all his genuine intellectual companionship, had been one of the more functional relationships of her adult life. The fact that it counted as the happiest tells you everything you need to know about the context. In 1948, between marriages, Rita had a relationship with Howard Hughes that ended when she became pregnant by him and traveled to Europe alone to end the pregnancy. She was a major Hollywood star, traveling alone, dealing with a private medical crisis, with no support structure of any kind. In Europe, she met Prince Ali Khan. He was the son of the Aga Khan, the leader of the Ismaili sect of Islam, and one of the most celebrated playboys in international society, a man known across the world for his charm, his horsemanship, his social ease, and his almost unlimited appetite for women. They married on May 27, 1949, in a ceremony on the French Riviera that generated global press coverage. Rita was now a princess. Their daughter Yasmin was born later that year, and from the outside, the marriage looked like exactly the life a love goddess deserved. Villas in the south of France, international travel, wealth without limit. From the inside, it was the same story she had been living since she was 18 years old. Ali Khan could not be faithful. His affairs were numerous, constant, and conducted with the brazenness of a man who had never experienced any consequence for his behavior. Rita's fear of abandonment, which had been installed in her long before she ever met any of her husbands, made each new betrayal more destabilizing than the last. By 1953, the marriage was over. Rita had failed to secure child support from Ali Khan for their daughter Yasmin. She left Europe with very little money and returned to Hollywood, where her career had continued in her absence, but her position had shifted. She married Dick Haymes the same year, directly after the Ali Khan divorce. Haymes was a singer whose own career was in steep decline and who was facing serious legal difficulties related to his immigration status. The relationship was troubled almost immediately. Rita financially supported Haymes during his legal battles, depleting what remained of her own savings. In 1955, at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Los Angeles, in front of witnesses, Haymes struck Rita in the face. She packed her bags and walked out that night and never went back. Her doctor ordered her to remain in bed for several days following the incident. She was left with very little money, having spent what she had on a man who repaid her by hitting her in a public restaurant. She sued Orson Welles for unpaid child support during this period. The lawsuit was unsuccessful and added to her stress and financial strain. Her fifth and final marriage was to film producer James Hill in 1958. They had known each other for only 4 months before marrying. The relationship ended in 1961 when Hill filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty. Rita had, by this point, begun to exhibit the early signs of what would eventually be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, though nobody understood that yet. Her behavior had been becoming erratic, her memory unreliable, her moods difficult to predict. Hill interpreted it as difficult character rather than illness and walked away. By the early 1960s, Rita Hayworth's film career had effectively ended. She continued to take roles when they were offered through the 1960s and into the early 1970s, including her final film, The Wrath of God, in 1972. But the great Columbia years were long over. She was living in an apartment in New York. She was drinking heavily, a dependency that had developed over the difficult years of her later marriages, and that the world found easy to reach for as an explanation for everything that was going wrong with her. But alcohol was only part of the picture. Something else was happening, something that had nothing to do with drinking and everything to do with her brain. She began to repeat herself in conversations. She forgot things she should have remembered. She lost track of the threads of discussions she was in the middle of. Her daughter Yasmin, then a teenager at boarding school, began to notice during their weekly phone calls that her mother was asking the same questions she had already asked, that she sounded confused in ways that went beyond tiredness or distraction. The world interpreted what it saw through the lens of what it expected. Rita Hayworth had been difficult. Rita Hayworth drank. Whatever was going wrong was obviously the alcohol. The tabloids ran stories about her erratic behavior. Former colleagues spoke carefully about how sad it was to see her this way. Nobody asked what was actually wrong with her brain. In January 1976, Rita Hayworth was escorted off a commercial aircraft in a state that witnesses described as disheveled and disoriented. The incident made international headlines. The coverage was not kind. The love goddess had lost her dignity, the reports implied, along with her looks. She had not. She had Alzheimer's disease. But nobody would say those words for another 5 years. In 1980, a neurologist at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York began to suspect the truth. In 1981, after Rita's reluctance to undergo a CT scan had been overcome, the diagnosis was confirmed. She had Alzheimer's disease. She was 62 years old. By this point, according to Yasmin's own account, her mother was already significantly impaired. The diagnosis brought relief because it finally explained what had been happening, and it brought devastation because it confirmed there was no way back. Yasmin Aga Khan moved her mother into her own apartment in New York and became her full-time caregiver. She described the experience in interviews with an honesty that is almost unbearable to read. Rita would look at her daughter and ask, with complete sincerity, "Who are you?" She would become agitated and aggressive for no reason that Yasmin could understand or predict. She required round-the-clock nursing care, the basics of daily life, getting dressed, bathing, eating, became battles that Yasmin fought alongside the nurses every single day. I had to regulate her medication as she became more aggressive, Yasmin said, and just the basics of eventually trying to get her in the shower. It was very painful. Rita Hayworth, who had been put on the cover of Life magazine and on the side of an atomic bomb, who had danced with Fred Astaire and married a prince, spent her final years being coaxed into the shower by her daughter, not knowing who she was or had been. The industry that had made its money on her image was nowhere. Yasmin Aga Khan did not stay nowhere. She testified before Congress in 1983 about the impact of Alzheimer's disease on families, using her mother as the most visible and devastating example of what the disease actually did to a real human being. She helped establish Alzheimer's Disease International in 1985 and served as its honorary president for years. The Rita Hayworth Gala, which she founded through the Alzheimer's Association, has raised over $85 million for research into the disease that took her mother. Rita Hayworth became, entirely against her will and without any understanding of what was happening to her, the first well-known public figure to bring widespread attention to Alzheimer's disease. Her face, which had been used to sell films and magazines and war bonds and to decorate weapons of mass destruction, was now being used to raise money for medical research. It was the most meaningful use anyone had ever made of her image. It was the one she never got to choose. Rita Hayworth died on May 14, 1987, in her daughter's New York apartment. She was 68 years old. She was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, not far from the studios where she had danced and performed and been transformed and controlled and used for 3 decades. History has given Rita Hayworth a comfortable legacy. The love goddess, the pin-up queen, the woman who made Fred Astaire look good, the glamorous star whose later years were sadly diminished by illness. That version leaves out almost everything that actually mattered. She was a child performer who was pulled out of school at 12 and never allowed to go back. She was a sexual abuse survivor whose damage was never treated because the concept of treating it did not yet exist in any meaningful way. She was a woman whose name, hair color, and physical appearance were altered by men who had financial interests in making her more commercially useful. She was an actress who refused the most powerful man at her studio and paid for that refusal throughout her entire career. She was a woman who supported every man she married with her own earnings and was repaid by one of them with a punch in the face at a nightclub. She was also, in the end, the first person to put a human face on a disease that millions of families were suffering through in silence and isolation. Not because she chose to, but because the disease chose her, and her daughter refused to let that mean nothing. Rita Hayworth once said, "Every man I have ever known fell in love with Gilda and woke up with me." She said it as a lament. It was also, if you listen carefully, an accusation of a world that preferred the image to the person, that preferred the glove removal to the woman removing it, that preferred the love goddess to the frightened girl from Brooklyn, who had spent her whole life being told that what she actually was would never be quite enough. Before we close, if you have stayed this far and this story has moved you, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to Behind the Pearls. Every week, we tell the stories of women the world reduced to a single image. Hit subscribe so you never miss one. She was born Margarita Cancino in Brooklyn and died Rita Hayworth in her daughter's apartment in New York, 68 years later, not knowing her own name. In between those two moments was a life of extraordinary talent, extraordinary suffering, and an almost complete absence of the one thing she had been searching for since she was 3 years old and her grandfather first stood her on a dance floor. Someone who saw her. Not Gilda. Her, Behind the Pearls, exists for this, for the women whose names were changed without their consent, for the women who were put on atomic bombs without their permission, for the women who spent their final years not knowing who they were, cared for by one loyal person, while the industry that had consumed their youth did nothing. Rita Hayworth deserved better. So did the world that called her a goddess. and then looked away when she needed someone to look back. If this story moved you, subscribe to Behind the Pearls and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The next pearl is already waiting, and her story is just as extraordinary. I will see you there.